Devilman the Demon Bird picks up where the previous OVA left off, kind of, sort of, where, except for, like, Ryo is alive. He just basically ends up getting sent to a hospital, although the end of the previous OVA sort of implies he's dead, but whatever. Anyway, so it's basically split into two, maybe arguably three parts, where at the start, Akira ends up fighting a turtle demon who kidnaps people, and then when he eats them, he brings them into part of his shell, and then there's this whole issue where Akira doesn't want to kill the turtle guy because the people are still technically alive, and one of them is actually his mom. Then there's the second part where a group of minor demons are attacking Miki's family, and then her mom and dad die. And then there's the third part where Akira just ends up fighting the bird demon. I would say that one of my issues that sort of held over from the first OVA is still pretty consistently there, which is to say that Devilman, these OVAs as a whole, are just sort of like mean-spirited, and so it ends up with this issue where if everything is dark and miserable and terrible the entire time, you end up getting fucking bored with it, and it ends up not having as much impact. If there's too much darkness and not enough light, it just goes pitch black, and who gives a shit? And yeah, it's very much a sort of issue that prevails throughout this whole thing, where the only, like, light-hearted moments, I suppose, are moments where Akira and Miki are just being super fucking horny for each other, which sort of holds over to one of the issues I had with the first OVA, which is that, as a whole, these Devilman OVAs really just seem an excuse to throw a bunch of blood and guts and violence and tits on the screen, and it really doesn't feel like there's too much substance. The first OVA talked about environmental issues and melting polar ice caps, whereas this one delves into a bit of an anti-war message and about how humans building weapons, but it's sort of just used as a sort of method for Ryo to wax poetic and doesn't really have too much gravitas or weight in the actual story or narrative. It's just sort of like placed there on the table and then vaguely ignored. And so I would actually say that the fact that it is bringing up these issues is actually kind of a detraction to the story's quality as a whole, if only because it doesn't do anything once it brings them up. It's completely performative. I'd also like to talk about the degradation of Akira's personality, where Akira in the first OVA is introduced as a guy who's basically willing to sacrifice his life and body just for a bunny rabbit. The Akira post the Amon possession in this sort of ends up in a scenario where he is rude, he's crude, he's violent, he's aggressive towards his friends, and I don't think this is necessarily bad. He is being possessed by a demon after all, but what I would like to see is a slow degradation of his personality, where we see Amon's demon tendencies slowly take over. Instead, it's more like a switch that gets flipped. He's a nice guy, and then he's suddenly a shithead the second the demon takes over. There's no sense of subtlety, and so it really does go to lend to the idea that Devilman as a whole is actually fairly shallow. I will say that I appreciate that the premier demon in this, which is Sirene, is seemingly one of the types of demons that we saw in the very opening cinematic of the original OVA, presumably the one that got, like, eaten by the flower, but then took over the flower and then turned into a weird consumption monster. I will also have to say that there is a weird sort of like romance between Sirene and this weird armadillo monster that shows up after she prays to Satan. However, I don't think this armadillo monster ever comes up before, and then he's like, I always loved you, Sirene, and then he, like, tears his head off. It's, like, really stupid and out of left field. I feel like it could have worked if the show had actually earned it, and we'd actually gotten to see these characters established better, but I don't remember this armadillo at any other point, and the only thing we see from Sirene is her killing a bunch of people a few million years ago. And hilariously enough, she's such a fucking goofball in this, because while we're having these scenes of semi-lighthearted levity between Akira and Miki, it cuts away from them being horny for each other to Sirene just standing on a rooftop monologuing in the rain about, oh, I'm gonna eat your blood, I'm gonna get you, I'm gonna eat your guts. It looks so fucking stupid. So it becomes impossible to take this fucking character seriously. And I would say that the number one thing about this is because there could theoretically be some enjoyment, especially if you're into really shitty dubs. But what really gets me is the fact that there's this sort of just like unnecessarily gratuitous, overly long fight scenes where like a lot of civilians die for no fucking reason. And I don't think it adds to it. I think it's supposed to add to the brutality of the OVA itself, but it kind of falters in doing that because the entire OVA has been brutal the entire time. Like at one point, Akira just cuts a fucking plane in half, and it's like, why? What was the point of doing that? Right? It doesn't even seem in character for a character that is supposed to be heroic and pure-hearted in order for him to take over his own demon. So that ends up in like a fight scene between him and Selene, which I swear to fucking Christ lasts like 30, 40 minutes. It's like the entire OVA is just him fighting this bird. It's so fucking boring. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye.